What's up YouTube, ODST General back again, and today we are going to be talking about Warthunder, more specifically submarines. Now, before we get into today's video, I do want to ask you guys to just bear with me as I do this. Not very often, but this is going to be one of those times that I do a scripted video, and there's going to be a little bit of winging this with the script, which is more of a rough outline, but it's a pretty wordy script, and there's a lot of things I want to try and cover in this, and talking out loud as I read through some of this, it's perhaps not the most coherent thoughts, but I will do my best to make this as coherent as humanly possible, while at the same time not trying to break from the script too much. So thank you guys ahead of time for bearing with me, especially if you guys watch this to the end, which my ego really needs, especially on these videos, which take a lot longer because of the script writing and editing and all that stuff. So guys, please, even if you didn't like the video, please. Okay, let's get into it. Let's get back on track here. So, for players who have been playing Warthunder for a long time, the idea of submarines coming to Warthunder may have felt inevitable, perhaps even at this point long overdue. That's thanks in large part to the Silent Thunder April Fool's event, which happened all the way back in 2018, which temporarily added 3 modern submarines to the game. The event even made an unprecedented return in 2020. However, despite the work to add 3 submarines, unique features, and a slew of other changes that were needed to add them into the game, the question has always remained as to whether or not we would actually get to see submarines make an official appearance in part of Warthunder's actual naval game mode. With the Apex Predators update, however, we seem to have gotten somewhat of a confirmation that work has at least continued on submarines. Audio lines were added to naval vessels with this update, and within the files for those naval lines, several voice lines unique to submarine operations were found in the game files. This is far from official confirmation or a proper announcement of their addition to the game, but just last patch, assets from the F-16 were included in the files, revealing it was being worked on prior to its official announcement for Apex Predators. With that being the case, it means we could see submarines as soon as next patch, though it's also worth keeping in mind that files have been found for other vehicles with years going by and no release. I'm looking at you, PBM-5A. Now, over the last several years, I have seen a lot of talk about submarines, from players hyped to their addition, those who are skeptical there's even enough submarines and variety to them to warrant their addition, and players who are outright against their addition because they could ruin any potential balance in Warthunder naval, if that's even a thing at this point. Now, all nations currently playable in naval have utilized numerous submarines of various classes. Even Italy had over 100 submarines at their disposal during World War II. Further bolstering the potential roster, Gaijin could even utilize captured submarines or those used by nations currently not found in naval game modes. It is difficult to say, though, how those might be integrated into the tech tree. Would we potentially see subs from as early as World War I or the interwar period? Where would they start in the tech tree? Would they start alongside destroyers or cruisers? Being so radically different from other ships, could we even potentially see a third naval tech tree? Or perhaps ocean-going submarines in the Blue Water Fleet and coastal submarines with the coastal vessels? There is no doubt that submarines bring many questions. Questions Gaijin has no doubt already faced if they have even considered adding submarines. Of course, naval has faced some pretty radical changes before, so I think anything could potentially happen, and even if submarines come out, we could see major changes following their release once they are in-game. There is also no question that submarines have the potential to create a lot of problems, if not balanced and implemented properly. However, despite the potential issues submarines bring, I see a potential fix to one of naval's biggest problems now. Naval currently has a pretty clear progression from PT boats to destroyers, destroyers to cruisers, then cruisers to battleships and battle cruisers. Each of these types of vessels, in theory, brings their own advantages and disadvantages to a fight. However, with BR compression, what is currently happening is players who sit lower in the tech tree face an uphill battle against ships that are vastly more powerful and technologically superior in some cases. Now, this isn't always an issue. Luck of the draw on map and game mode play a big factor in how well you do, leaving kind of an unfortunate matter of RNG to whether or not you're going to do well. Well, a good naval lineup should have a variety of ships so you are prepared for any situation you might encounter. With that very linear progression I mentioned earlier, you will likely find yourself in a position where you simply have yet to unlock a vessel to deal with any scenario you might encounter. So players are stuck, for instance, suffering through maps like Ocean with destroyers or weak cruisers while facing off against battleships, and they have no cover or anything to play to their strengths and advantages. When first introduced, battleships quickly dominated naval. Few ships could penetrate their hulls, and just as few could stand up to the barrage of their guns. Battleships did have a couple weaknesses, though. They had slow speed, long reload times, and poor anti-air coverage. That meant they were a poor choice for controlling map points, and if they didn't stay close to the rest of their team, they could very easily be bombed by planes, with little to no risk to the planes. This has been changing. While some ships like the Arizona are still slow and they still have poor anti-air coverage, other ships like the Alaska and the Scharnhorst have very good anti-air defenses. All of these ships have been seeing improvements in armor and design, meaning they're faster, tougher, and just generally harder to sink, even if you score a hit on them. And we've also had the addition of remote hydroplanes that players in these giant slow behemoths can launch, and they can capture points even before a destroyer can get to them. This creates a fairly big problem for new players, and casual players who have yet to get up there to a battleship. They're now facing ships that can potentially kill them in a single shot. They're near impervious to any of their weapons, and the biggest weaknesses of these ships have quickly diminished, and they will become harder to kill as we get even newer vessels. Now, that little tangent perhaps will make my next suggestion obvious. The addition of submarines in their own lineup in the Blue Water Fleet tree, perhaps with a similar addition of coastal-based submarines for the coastal tree. The important part, though, is having a separate research alternative to what we have now. With tanks and planes, lineups are typically based around the functions or rough role of a vehicle, creating separate lines that players can research with unique abilities that make those trees useful. However, Naval doesn't split their tree like this, perhaps for fear of comparison to World of Warships or some other reason I'm unaware of. While battleships are getting tougher and tougher, a well-placed torpedo or naval mine can still easily cripple, if not outright kill one. These things do already exist, but the problem is getting close enough to actually use them. Battleships usually are operating at a distance from any landmass due to map designs and spawn points, meaning PT boats and destroyers often have no safe means with which to get close and let off torpedoes at them. Not to mention enemy team usually between them and the battleship in the first place. Planes face a similar issue. Making it through a battery of very accurate anti-aircraft fire from well-equipped vessels can be difficult, but a whole team borders on impossible. Of course, launching torpedoes from a distance merely means the battleship needs to just adjust course a little bit every once in a while to avoid being hit. A submarine which can operate under the water, out of sight of the devastating battleship salvos? That sounds like a good alternative to me. The idea is pretty simple, but that's all it needs to be. Something that can act as a counter to increasingly powerful battleships, something capable of getting in close with a barrage of torpedoes or deploying naval mines. Submarines would be able to take advantage of battleships' weaknesses, their still generally slow speed and lack of maneuverability. There is probably some World of Warships player screaming "no" at the top of their lungs watching this. Submarines were added there. And while I haven't played World of Warships in a long time myself, I have seen a lot of people exclaiming they broke the balance of World of Warships. So, the next question asked is, how do we balance submarines so they don't just become a next battleship? It is unclear what submarine gameplay might look like in Warthunder if and when they are officially released. It is safe to assume, however, the small taste of submarines we got in the special events isn't going to be a great indicator of what earlier submarines will look like when they're added to the game. If they're added to the game. Now, even with their unguided munitions and limited ability to potentially operate underwater, submarines would no doubt prove very challenging for surface ships who couldn't shoot at them to deal with. The first big counter that comes to mind is limiting the time submarines could spend underwater. Limiting things like the amount of available air supply, electrical batteries, adding things like crush depth, and submarine damage, forcing them to surface to repair. All these things are potential options, but not all of this would be very realistic. Submarines, under normal circumstances, should be more than capable of operating for the duration of an entire Warthunder match. Also, many submarines were capable of operating in very deep waters, which would likely be problematic on many of the coastal maps in Naval, which would have seabeds that were far shallower than the maximum submarine dive depth. Additionally, forcing them to surface a lot would nullify the biggest advantage they have against ships like cruisers and battleships. Alternatively, submarines would need to raise to periscope depth in order to actually spot and attack targets, so that might be one potential route or thing to consider when considering how to force them to the surface. However, if the goal is to potentially limit the submarines from being overpowered, it is also worth keeping in mind that outside of torpedoes, they typically only carried smaller caliber deck guns and anti-air weaponry. So this might be a decent option for arcade battles, but I think realistic could potentially have better options integrated because they are at a very big disadvantage while surfaced. One thing we saw with the submarine test was the use of passive versus active sonar. Passive sonar allowed the submarines to see terrain, but enemies would only show up with directional location to emulate the use of a hydrophone. Whereas the active sonar would show enemy locations, but would also make the submarine much easier to spot while you were using it. Engine noise and other aspects could also make submarines more difficult or easier to spot depending on the situation. This seemed like a pretty good system, and it's likely to return when we do see submarines added into the game. Again, if we see submarines added into the game. Hopefully, we will see this extended to other vessels like destroyers and coastal ships, like subchasers. Though obviously the system would likely need to be tweaked and balanced, I think this is going to be a very important thing for countering and dealing with submarines potentially. In reality, a submarine's greatest threat was probably aircraft, though. When operating on or near the surface, even in clear waters, aircraft could oftentimes see submarines when other ships could not. Capable of dropping bombs and other ordnance down onto the submarines, planes would be a major threat to them. Of course, aircraft would still need to get past surrounding vessels, AA guns, but it seems likely that a lot of submarines would choose to operate a bit further away from the rest of their team, in an attempt to pick off lone targets or flank the larger ships in the back of the enemy formations. I personally feel like the munitions will probably be the biggest limiting factor as to the capability of submarines, though. While in arcade, submarines would get to reload their torpedoes after using them all, in realistic, they would need to capture a control point and wait to rearm torpedoes. This could be a point at which you force them to surface in order to actually reload the torpedo supply too. So that's one thing that you can maybe do in both realistic and arcade to force them to surface, as just a quick thought. I think one specific type of existing weapon in Warthunder, though, will need a massive rework, but it could be probably the ultimate weapon to keep submarines in line. Depth charges. Depth charges are currently glorified mines that operate with a set fuse on the surface and detonate. Updating depth charges to actually sink and adding a variety of trigger types appropriate to them, such as hydrostatic valve, magnetic triggers, contact triggers, would all be great options. Depth charges are probably the best weapon for use against submarines and have a great deal of ways in which they could be improved and expanded on, with lots of different versions of potential in-game settings that players could change and tweak, such as changing the depths at which they detonated. Additionally, we already have the aircraft which traditionally carry depth charges and other anti-submarine warfare equipment in the game. Giving planes the ability to deploy depth charges would allow them to take advantage of their unique position of being able to spot and deal with submarines. In short, the addition of submarines would be a great counter to the dominance of battleships, allowing them to take advantage of their oftentimes slow speed, slow maneuverability, and slip past their greatest strength, their extremely powerful guns. At the same time, opening up expanded gameplay for ships like subchasers, destroyers, and aircraft, which would act as the counters to submarines. But the submarines do bring their own other challenges and difficulty in trying to deal with and kill them. Questions like what happens if the last person on the enemy team is a submarine, and they just decide to go hide in a corner and drag out the match? What happens on a map like Ocean if the sub uses all of its torpedoes? Where should submarines spawn? These are just a few possible questions which will need to be addressed before submarines can be added. Anyways, guys, I just wanted to talk a little bit about submarines today, and being one of the 6 people who actually enjoys naval, I think that they are an exciting idea with a lot of potential to improve naval if they are executed correctly. But I want to know what you guys think of submarines being added to Warthunder. Do you guys want to see them added? What sort of changes do you think should come with submarines, and how would you guys counter submarines if the option was up to you? Let me know that down in the comments below, guys. Thanks for watching. Take it easy. I'll see you all in the next one.